Hello, everyone. We're so happy to have you here today. Welcome to our Ask the Expert series. If you're new to our webinar series, welcome, and thank you for joining us today. Criterion Edge runs multiple informative webinars throughout the year. For today's live question and answer topic, we'll be discussing the Performance Evaluation Report. And we're lucky enough to have two presenters today. The first is Laurie Mitchell, founder and president of Criterion Edge, a global medical and regulatory writing and safety services firm serving the medical device, pharmaceutical, and biotech industries. Laurie has over 20 years of experience in medical writing, safety and pharmacovigilance management, and regulatory reporting. Having provided regulatory and medical writing solutions to many pharma and medical device companies, both large and small, she is a proven leader in designing practical strategies to meet current global regulatory challenges. Laurie is also a published author and holds a Master of Nursing from UCLA. And our second speaker today and special guest is Dr. Sarah Chavez, Principal Medical Writer with Criterion Edge. Sarah has a BS in Biochemistry and a PhD in Molecular and Cellular Biology with 25 years of laboratory bench experience and has taught at the university level for the past 15 years. She has extensive scientific writing experience in an academic environment, as well for several large textbook publishers. Sarah's strong background in basic research and her extensive experience with regulatory writing will allow her to assist companies with IVDR readiness as part of the Criterion Edge team. And now I'll welcome Laurie to give an overview of today's session.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. This is a question and answer. We've got a lot of great questions. Many questions were already queued up and ready to go because they were asked at the time of registration. So thank you all for that. So we're going to get right to them in a minute. But in general, we're going to be focusing on questions about how to align your internal processes and systems to comply with the rigorous IVDR regulations. Some of you may already have those processes and changes well underway, and others still may have questions about how to do that. We're going to talk about the planning and development stages of the performance evaluation report in particular. I know we have other questions that have to do with the feeder documents to the performance evaluation report, and we're happy to take those questions as well, because all of those documents ultimately feed into the report of your internal performance evaluation process, otherwise known as the PER. And then lastly, the technical documents on what is required in the performance evaluation report. In other words, what are some of those feeder documents that we as a writing team or your own internal writers writing this very complex report, what are the needed inputs that you can be prepared, you as a company and an organization should be preparing and aligning with IVDR requirements right now, because they're going to be needed downstream soon enough when you have to write your performance evaluation reports. Risk management, PMS, for example, come to mind.
Great, and we have a lot of great questions that have come to us, so let's get right to it and get to our first question. Laurie and Sarah, let me know when you can see the question on your screen.
We can. I can.
Okay. Yes. Okay, great. Here's our first question. As I understand it, the PMPF report will provide input to the PE report. Does the associated PE plan also need to be updated?
So Sarah, I can take that question. So this is a question about two different documents, one in which houses data and the other is a plan. So plans don't house data, whether it's a performance evaluation plan or with your medical device colleagues, a clinical evaluation plan. Plans don't have data. They state intent. What do you intend to do and how do you intend to do it? And how often do you intend to do it? That's essentially what a plan is. We plan to do these things. The PMPF report is very specific. That has data. And that data, those data, can be used ultimately in your performance evaluation report on your device under evaluation. So the PMPF data is very valuable. It's heavily weighted. It's important data, and it is most definitely an input into the PER if you have it. Remember, and one last thing, remember post-market performance follow-up data is not the same as your PMS data, your post-market surveillance data of complaints and so forth. What's the difference? The difference is that PMPF data is proactively gathered by you, whereas PMS data is passively received by you and your company. So there are processes set up globally for end users to provide input back to the company on the use of their product. That's what PMS surveillance is. That's not what PMPF surveillance is. That's a proactive, you're out seeking information. So I hope that helped a little bit. Then yes, does the associated PE plan also need to be updated? Definitely. The PE plan, the PEP, needs to identify the sources of PMPF data. And if you get your PMPF report through some type of survey or investigation, or you're getting it externally through end users, whatever your source of your PMPF data are, you need to describe that in your plan.
Great, thanks, Laurie. I think that was a great distinction and a great answer. I'll get to our next question. Here it is. Do we expect a guideline or template to be published on how to structure the PEP and the essential content?
Sarah, I'll let you field that one.
So pretty much what we've already been presented, what's already out in the regulations that have been published is kind of what we expect to get. There are templates that exist, and we have a template that we use in order to structure both our PEP as well as our PER. They're not necessarily going to be provided by the regulatory agencies though. So really until these go through notified body review and we have further insights as to what they're truly expecting, we're kind of relying heavily on existing templates from the MDR world. And that's where having that background and understanding what some of the different requirements were regarding MDR really does help with making sure that the template that you are designing meets the expectations.
Yeah, and I want to build on that. Thank you, Sarah. What I want to build on that was an important point that Sarah made, which was the crossover, if you will, between what's happening in the MDR world and and the documents required in the MDR world, which with regards to the PER and the PEP in the IVD world have identical components in the medical device world, which are clinical evaluation reports and clinical evaluation plans. With regards to those two documents, which are hand in glove documents, they go, if you're writing a PER, you need to have a PEP that matches it, that goes with it. So don't think that you can write a PER without visiting your PEP, because those two documents stand together. But with regards to the pressure testing that's already been going on for years in the medical device space with these templates for their CER and CEP and safety and performance objectives, acceptance criteria, what's expected for documentation, levels of evidence, how do you approach your analysis of your risk benefit profile. All of these things have direct crossover into the IVD space and are often also described in MedDev 2.7/1 Rev 4. And that's what IVDR points to, as well as MDR. So again, there are a lot of lessons learned from the MDR space that can be leveraged in the IVD space, but the real final truth will come out once the notified bodies begin to get into a rhythm of reviewing these documents and giving us direct feedback on the actual documents, not secondarily lessons learned from the MDR space. So that's what we're all waiting for. We're all waiting for that. And we'll see what it comes up with.
Great, thank you for those helpful tips, Laurie. Here is our next question. Do we need to use a template for PER plans and reports?
Well, Sarah, I'll let you keep talking about templates right there on that one.
Yeah, so I think having a solid template to build off of, it will need to be customized depending on your particular IVD. So clearly there are going to be certain components that will be consistently required, and you have to make sure that the overall template that you're utilizing is in alignment with what they're expecting to see and meets all of the basic criteria. But as far as sort of the headings and the precise language to use within those headings, a lot of that will need to be customized based on your particular test that you're, there are going to be certain subheadings and certain sections that are going to have to really reflect the specifics of your test. So in general, we have a general template that we start with, but whenever we have our initial meetings with clients, we discuss in detail based on their IFU and some other supporting documents, what are some of the specifics that we need to make sure to call attention to, or how can we best design our template to really reflect the overall information that is unique to your particular device.
And I would only add that from a organizational standpoint, across your organization and across your quality management system, it would be advisable that you establish a template for these reports, as I'm sure you have for many other things that you do, and rev those templates as needed for consistency, because once you start submitting PER after PER after PER, you're going to want to follow a template. And we always, with the clients we work with, we always first ask if they have a template that they're comfortable with using, that they would like us to use, or do they want us to use like our templates? So templates are important.
Yeah, we've had several clients who have had multiple reports that they're trying to design. And what we found is that once we identify a template that's a really strong template, we try to make it versatile enough that multiple different, like let's say they have different tests for different bacteria. We want to make sure that the templates that we utilize for one particular test or analyte are similar in structure to what they would use for their other different tests. And that's going to just streamline the updating process so much from an internal perspective, because you know what goes where within this overall template.
Yeah, that's a great point there too, is that once you establish a template and you use it, then consistency sets in. And with consistency comes efficiency. And over and over again, if you're submitting to your notified body the same overall template and format and approach, then the notified body reviewer can concentrate on the content and the analyses and not get distracted by a poor template that doesn't flow, doesn't effectively show off your arguments and data. And that's what you want your notified body to concentrate on your analysis and arguments and story, not to be distracted by things that aren't important. They shouldn't be distracted by, I can't read this, I can't follow it, I'm skipping around. That makes, from the MDR experience that we've had for years now, that makes them cranky. And then they start fussing about in a review, when they send their responses, they fuss about, where is this? I can't find that. Can you explain more about this? So a strong template will also avoid some of that unnecessary confusion.
Great, thank you. Here's our next question, ladies. How do you approach the state of the art for general use IVDs that are not specific to a particular analyte?
So I want to just jump in here and say that Sarah is not only our internal expert with all things IVDR, but she is also our internal expert on and a specialty writer for all of our state-of-the-art sections, or many of them, or she oversees and trains other people to do that. So this has got her name written all over it, Sarah.
Yeah, so I think this is going to be coming up more and more. I think the important thing to remember is sort of what the overall purpose is for your state of the art. You're trying to establish that your particular IVD, sort of its place within the entire landscape of alternatives. So even if your particular IVD is not detecting a particular analyte, in theory, it's supporting the detection of other analytes. So let's say you have a test for quantifying DNA. You know, the DNA itself, your analyte isn't a particular gene target. It's the detection and the quantification of DNA. So in that case, you're just trying to provide basically an oversight as to how this particular test and its approach to detecting that particular its end use is to collect DNA and analyze the DNA. So you want to make sure that you're explaining what are the alternatives for that process. So in theory, there are other tests. If your test was unavailable, what would be the alternatives? And you also want to go into details about kind of how your particular test would perform with sort of in conjunction with detection of particular analytes. So there are going to be certain risks or benefits associated with using your IVD. And a lot of that will pull from your IFU or some of your internal analytical testing. But ultimately, you need to find a way to tell a story that explains how your test supplements the accuracy and efficiency of other testing purposes. So thinking sort of downstream of when your test would be utilized, what are some of the other critical features that make your test sort of be falling within the state of the art?
Great, thank you so much, Sarah. Here is our next question. How often should one check if there is new clinical data and update the CPR?
Oh, the CPR. So I'll start with that one. So this is a question specific to the clinical performance report. So let me just make sure that everyone on the call knows that the clinical performance report, it really houses one topic and one topic only, which is all of the clinical data on your, for both safety and performance on the subject device. The subject device being the device that is under, will ultimately be under clinical evaluation, or sorry, performance evaluation, will come under a performance evaluation report. So the question here is, so let's just make sure we understand a little bit of the flow. The flow is that there's the APR, the analytical performance report, the SVR, the scientific validity report, and the CPR, the clinical performance report. What is the topic of all three of those? Is that this comes into your company decisions from a regulatory standpoint. What devices can you group of your own, can you group together because they are equivalent to each other? Equivalence can be established between them. And thus, let's just say you have two analytes that are extremely close to each other and they are essentially equivalent with just a few minor changes between those. I'm just using this as an example. Then those two analytes would be considered in the medical device world, we would call them a product family, which is essentially what we're talking about here in the IVD world as well. Two analytes where equivalence can be established in clinical, technical, and biological terms, and thus they are equivalent to each other. So the data for one can be applied to the data can be applied to the other. So they're married. So that means that you can now, in the scientific validity report, you can talk about that technology and the technology of those analytes together as you're talking about the scientific validity of those of that science and that technology. In the CPR, you can then look for published literature and other manufacturer-held data on both of those devices because they are equivalent. They're twins, essentially, to each other. So the data for one can be applied to the data for the other. So think about that first when you're the grouping of your analytes and devices and your technology and so forth. Can equivalence be established? Once you get those groupings, then you can combine them into these activities such as creating a CPR for both, for 2-in-1 CPR. Now, the question is, how often should one check if there are new clinical data and update the CPR? Minimally, you're going to need to do that at every performance evaluation time point. That clearly has to be done when it's time to do a performance evaluation of your two devices, you know, one product family. So it has to be done then. Whether that's 1 year or if you can justify something greater than a 1 year frequency of your PERs, but it would need to be done then. But there's more to that too, which is now you're also getting into post-market surveillance complaints. And also this impacts your post-market performance follow-up data. How often should you be refreshing or updating those data? That's a different question that you need to answer internally. Post-market surveillance is a continuous loop of surveillance of incoming data so that it loops back to your quality management system, your risk system, and then those data then inform updates to risk and harms, IFU, etc. That's a continuous loop. So if we ask how often, and that's clinical data, that PMS is a continuous loop. How often should we be checking perhaps for more published data? That is, I don't believe the IVDR requires that other than at the time points of the performance evaluation report being updated.
But yeah, this definitely goes back to the importance of having that plan and the templates in place, because as you are doing these updates, if you have to basically rewrite it, or if you're not consistent between the previous draft and the current update, you're basically rewriting it every time. Whereas if you have a really strong template, you can pretty much run the search as you've done before to identify any updated clinical performance data that's been published. And you have a pretty solid template in which to just sort of update the existing CPR. You're not rewriting it from zero.
Right. But thank you, Sarah. And my point was really a little bit off topic, but related is before these updates are happening, what we find a lot of our clients aren't doing are making these initial early decisions about how to group their devices. Would you say that's true, Sarah? In some cases, is that they're not looking at like here are all our devices. Do we have to write a PER on all of them? Not necessarily, but what does it take to group them? What are the decisions that the checkpoints that need to be assessed in order to allow you to group two devices together and establish their equivalence? And we find that sometimes those early and internal decisions aren't really being tackled.
Yeah, and the having clarity on that point and knowing, we've seen it both ways, where some people want to group everything together and that's not necessarily appropriate, and other times
or possible.
Exactly.
Yes, right.
Yeah, and sometimes other folks want to try to separate everything, and once you get to writing, you start to realize that there are a lot of sort of shared features or characteristics Whether or not that means that they will ultimately stay within the PER, a single PER, is something that you will need to decide very early on, just to maintain that efficiency of the overall process.
And it's all about establishing equivalence. So we should probably have a webinar or Q&A session, Sarah, just about how do you establish equivalence.
Yeah, that's
because
definitely been a topic.
It's very, very specific, and it must be very well documented in your PER, point by point by point. Sometimes that's one of the largest sections that we write when equivalence is necessary.
Yeah, it can save you time down the line, but it has to be set up well and very well organized early in the process.
Yeah, great question.
All right, thank you. Here's our next question. If using clinical guidelines, consensus, or expert opinions, or published experience for SC or CP, is reporting the methodology and strategy for that type of search expected to be included?
Well, I'll jump in and say yes, but I'll let Sarah, I'll let Sarah expand. That's actually a yes/no question, and the answer is a resounding yes. But Sarah, maybe you can put a little color on it.
Yes, overall, the goal is to explain your rationale for why you've identified those particular consensus statements or clinical guidelines. What you don't want to have happen is for the notified body to pick it up and it looks as if you've only selected guidelines that sort of support the use of your particular IVD over others. You want to make sure that this is also methodologically sound and a robust and a unbiased approach to the search. So in doing so, you will try to identify, usually through some of the systematic literature reviews, you'll identify review articles or other consensus guidelines that present on a variety of different organizations or groups. You'll want to make sure that you've identified all relevant groups and organizations and then searched for guidelines that are specifically calling out your IVD. So reporting and documenting that strategy for searching, how you came up with the list that you did, and how you ultimately settled on the ones that you're reporting. It may be as simple as saying that a particular organization does not have guidelines that directly discuss your particular IVD, whereas others did. But either way, that whole process needs to be very well reported and documented so it doesn't appear as if you're only sort of picking and choosing which guidelines you want to report on.
All right, thank you, Sarah. Here is our next question. IVDR Annex XIII 1.1 requires a description of the state of the art in the PE plan. Can you describe the aspects of the SOA that are required in the PEP versus the SVR?
So I'm going to let Sarah answer this, but I will jump in first to say is that this has been an evolving story in the MD in the medical device world, whereas early CEPs that were being written really didn't need to include much about the state of the art other than we intend to write one in the CER. I think that's been evolving, Sarah, over the last few years, and now that's a different answer than maybe it was 3 years ago. And we would expect then that the current state of that in the medical device world will probably translate over into the IVD space. So why don't you explain a little bit, Sarah, about what part of the state of the art needs to be in the is what we think will need to be put in the PEP, and of course we'll get feedback from the notified bodies if it's too much or not enough. But why don't you give a little bit more information about that?
Yes, so based on our sort of consensus with the medical device world and MedDev Rev 4, there is some description about sort of the difference between the SOA in the CEP versus the CER. So that's kind of the easiest place to start with really trying to narrow down this question. In a typical CEP, or in this case a PEP, The SOA needs to include your acceptance criteria for the data, for your performance data and the safety and the benefits. And this is where you want to set up your benefit risk ratio and the acceptability of any of the particular risks that you're going to be eventually evaluating as part of your clinical report, or your CPR. So it's going to help you within the PEP. That's where the SOA should help you justify the amount of clinical evidence that you need to be able to demonstrate that you're aligned with your general performance requirements. So then when you move into your PER, the SOA kind of builds off of that. So it's going to include further discussion about what would happen if this, like the medical background of that particular disease or whatever analyte you're detecting. You're going to want to explain the particulars of the analyte. How is it being used for diagnostic purposes? What are the risks and benefits of using this particular type of diagnostic technology over others? What are the risks of false positives and false negatives? So it basically expands upon the information that you've included in your PEP to include more specifics. And this will be where you'll be able to kind of tie it in and refer to information that will be then expounded upon in your APR and your CPR. But within the SVR, that's really where you're trying to provide the background as part of the SOA that this particular test, this particular approach to diagnostics can be considered state of the art. But the PEP is where you really want to sort of explain that those acceptance criteria and in the benefit risk ratio are justified and give you sort of a plan for moving forward.
So what Sarah, a couple of points that I want to emphasize what Sarah said there. That was a lot to digest, and you can get the recording of this afterwards if you want to run by that, because she really laid it out very, very clearly there, in my opinion. In our opinion, the SVR, which is a unique document to the IVD world, is the first and most foundational of all of your documents. It's the first, and I think Sarah would agree. You tackle it first, because what she mentioned there, which may have, you might not fully grasp the importance of it, is the establishment of the acceptance criteria for in the SVR, for the even publishing in the PEP, a plan, the acceptance criteria. The acceptance criteria and the safety and performance objectives, and thus the acceptance criteria that support those S&P objectives, that's a literature search from your competitor devices. That's an extremely robust and must be very well documented process, because it creates the bar in which your device's data will be compared to the state of the art for the same technology. And those acceptance criteria are derived from competitor data. You don't make those up. They come from a systematic literature review of your competitive landscape, and it's part of a competitive landscape that is published in the SVR and ultimately into the PEP and PER. So this SVR is the birth. It's step one. It's the beginning of everything, in my opinion. And start there and fan out from there, because that's where you're establishing your safety and performance objectives for the first time. That's where you're establishing the acceptance criteria from a competitor device search and a competitive landscape analysis. And from there, you move out to the CPR, which includes your own subject devices data. And you've already established the safety and performance objectives in the SVR, and you have identified the acceptance criteria for each of those S&P objectives, by which your own subject device data in the CPR will need to be evaluated against.
All right, thanks Laurie and Sarah for that answer. We have just under 10 minutes left, so we'll get through as many questions as we can. Our next question looks like it may be from someone from the medical device industry, but Laurie and Sarah, feel free to interpret it as you see fit.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
How often yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Olivia.
How often should the CER be updated? Do we need to conduct a literature search every time we update the CER?
So that's an easy question. And it's the same answer for PERs. So how often should the PER be updated? The answer to that is you need to justify in your PEP, your plan, the cadence by which you're going to update. Annually is very, very common. Biannually would be the next most common. Anything beyond that, Sarah, we've never written anything that's anything where it's. I think 95% of what we write in the medical device space is annual, and then there's a justification because it's not. That's the most frequent. So if you go beyond annual for your PER update, you're going to have to provide a solid justification about why you want to do it every 2 years and not every one, and what would underpin that decision. So so there's that. The second question is easy. It's a yes question. Do we need to conduct a literature search every time you update your PER? Yes. And those literature searches are on your competitor devices to update your acceptance criteria, and on your subject device to gather new published data on your subject device. And the third one is a state-of-the-art search that will update guidelines and other background information on the state-of-the-art of the technology of your device. So 3 searches need to be conducted every time you update your PER.
All right, thank you. Here's our next question. What is the most common notified body feedback or critique that you see in regards to the state of the art?
Sarah?
I would say in most cases, it's that you have not established state of the art. It's kind of a very simple feedback. For the most part, what I've found is identifying your competitors versus alternatives is kind of a tricky subject for a lot of folks. And really truly understanding kind of how to set up that background in the SOA. You want to show how your particular IVD fits into the entire landscape. And you want to show what are the alternative diagnostic technologies and what are your competitor diagnostic technologies. So in many cases, there's some confusion or there's maybe a lack of data out there. And the notified body is not going to accept that you just state there's no data. You're going to have to justify your approach and the data that you're using to establish those acceptance criteria. So you really want to make sure that you've conducted a very thorough SOA search to get as much insights as you can as to how the different clinical organizations, what are their recommendations regarding your particular IVD or testing in general. And if your IVD is maybe a new technology, that could be really challenging. So I think that's the main feedback that I've seen is just trying to be very clear and purposeful in how you design the safety and performance objectives that you've identified and how you define your alternatives versus your competitors to be able to really collect the most robust data set that you can.
My take, thank you, Sarah. That was, again, a very well said answer. I'm just going to editorialize here and just say, in my opinion, and I think most of the people that work at Criterion Edge, the state-of-the-art section, the scientific validity, state-of-the-art section is the most foundational and most important part of this whole chain of events. Probably nothing is more important than establishing In that, you're establishing the competitors, you're establishing the bar by which your subject device data will be measured, nothing, and you're justifying all that. If that is not well done and robustly researched, written, and justified, then it becomes a bit of a house of cards going forward. Your PER may cave in, your CPR may not be queued up well, because your acceptance criteria may be weak. So the SVR, if you're not paying attention to any other of these documents right now, pay attention to the SVR. It's the one that will set you up for success. I will also like to editorialize about what we mean by literature searches. And we have whole webinars, by the way, if you want to go to our website and look at whole webinars and white papers written about the robust nature of the literature searches that are required. And in a short word, these are not PubMed searches. These are not, you go to the internet and poke around. It's absolutely would not be accepted by the notified body. Maybe early on, because the notified body may be giving the IVD companies a bit of a pass on that. But that has not been our experience in the MDR world at all. They are requiring, and MedDev Rev 4 requires the same thing, that you're looking in MBase and Medline, that this is robust, methodologically sound, and reproducible searches. That's the notified body's take on this, is that if they've followed every step that you publish in the PER or in the SVR or CPR, every step, your search syntax, your search protocol, your results, what you screened, and which ones were excluded and why, all of those are, all that must be reported. So I would say that you need a medical librarian and a platform whereby you can specifically search MBase and Medline and maybe even other databases that are relevant to your device. So beware of PubMed searches on the internet. They won't hold up much under notified body scrutiny.
Great, thank you. Here's our next question. Who should review and who should approve the PER?
Oh, Sarah, why don't you, like who internally, I think is what this question is, or even external medical reviewers. So why don't you talk a little bit to that? That might be our last question.
Yeah, I think at least from my perspective, the majority of the folks who we interact with here at our group, we have a fairly large team who all review the entire document. So we have individual specialty writers who facilitate each of the individual sections, but it does take a team approach. This is not just one person going off in a room and writing the entire PER. You want to have specialized librarians, content experts, a data team who can help you extract the data, a quality control team who can make sure that the data is extracted properly. So all of that needs to happen as part of the regular process. And then you should definitely expect to undergo different internal revisions just to ensure that these are a lot of different moving pieces and moving documents. So you'll need to make sure that all of those documents have been integrated and sort of all pulled in together, but also that they don't feel like you've just taken independent reports and stapled them all together and called it done. The PER needs to tell that cohesive story. So having multiple content experts within your organization, as well as experts who have these ideas of templating and how to properly write and document these searches. It's going to require a village. It's definitely an intense process.
Typically in the medical device world, we when we send our first draft and then our second draft of the CER to our colleagues within the company, the first pass of the full draft of the CER and it's a full draft from beginning to end, is usually looked at by the project lead, the person that is our main contact for the delivery of this particular report, the CER report, because they're the most expert on the device itself. And so that person will typically go through it and give it a read. And these are usually hundreds of pages long. These documents, don't think that a PER is a 50-page document. It's a state-of-the-art section can be 50 pages. Mm-hmm. So these are enormous documents. And this person will probably high grade what they want to look at and to check on. They give us they give us their feedback. We adjust and polish and do some things. And then the second round of review usually goes out to, as Sarah just described, your cross-functional team, quality, regulatory, clinical, technical people. And they all should, and here's another bit of advice, they should all try to stay in their lane, if you will. In other words, your technical person might shouldn't be too worried about something, a regulatory thing, unless it relates directly to them. And we always appreciate if you point out, errors, obviously, or quality errors, or periods and all that, because we'll correct those in the review cycle. So it usually goes out to your internal team. And now this is something I don't know, and I'm just going to speculate on this. In the CER world of medical devices, there is always an external medical reviewer that also reviews from their perspective. Sarah, do you have any thoughts about that in the IVD world?
I have not heard specifically what any one group's plan is to that effect, but I would anticipate that they're going to take a very similar approach to what the medical device, the more reviewers in this case, I think, especially early on in this process, is going to help to make sure that you're all on the same page as to how to approach the PER.
And then I would say with regards to approval, that's certainly an internal decision by your team. But again, borrowing from our experience in the medical device space, I would assume that approvers really mean the signatories on the performance evaluation report, and that would be those aforementioned, reviewers. Your internal cross-functional people should likely be the approvers. If you have some sort of external expert, and that role is clearly defined, like say in an appendix, then that person sometimes signs. And then it's very common if we are writing the CER that our primary writer also signs as a not really an approver. We're not really approver as much as that it's documented that we were the author, the primary author. So that's how that usually rolls on a signature page for a CER.
Okay, thank you, Laurie. I think that was a great question and answer to end on. That's all the time we have today. Hope we were able to answer most of your questions, but if we didn't, please send us any questions you have to consult@criterionedge.com. Thank you again, Sarah and Laurie, and everyone again for joining us and for your wonderful questions. Take care and have a nice day.